Hello. And welcome to another fantastic, awesome, splendorific, out of this world, outstanding, so many great adjectives, it would take too long to describe it. Phillips Podcast, or P squared. Today's podcast is going to be on the Pythagorean Theorem, Part 2, Lesson 6.2. By the end of the podcast today, you should be able to use the Pythagorean Theorem to find the missing leg of a given right triangle. Right triangle has a right angle in it, and anytime you have a right triangle, you can use the Pythagorean Theorem. Here's a thought. If it's not a right triangle, you can't use the Pythagorean Theorem. Pythagorean Theorem only works for a right triangle. Leg. By definition, the two sides that form the right angle in a right triangle are called the legs. Squaring a number. Squaring a number means to multiply it by itself. Squaring a number, multiply it by itself. If you say squaring a number means to multiply it by 2, you are cub-like, epic failure. Squaring a number, multiply it by itself. Do not multiply it by 2. Hypotenuse. By definition, the hypotenuse is the longest side of a triangle. The longest side of a triangle, and it's always represented by the variable c. Hypotenuse is always represented by the variable c. Square root. Square root is the inverse. Plus 10 bears. Nice vocabulary word, Mr. Phillips. Square root is the inverse, the opposite of squaring a number. Square root. Inverse, opposite of squaring a number. Trust me, there's one more vocabulary word hiding in here. Told you. It's kind of just like the Cubs. It takes a while to find it. If you're asked to find the leg in a right triangle, you're going to subtract the numbers. If you're asked to find the leg in a right triangle, you're going to subtract the numbers. So let's take a look at a problem. This is just a quick review from our last podcast. We said the legs are the two sides that form a right angle. So by definition, these two sides of the triangle form the right angle. They are called legs. By definition, the longest side of a right triangle, the longest side in any triangle, is called the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is opposite diagonal from your right angle. We covered that in our last podcast, and we also said the Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. If you forget the Pythagorean theorem, look on your handy-dandy reference sheet. It's on your reference sheet. They just write it a little differently. And you can use the, nice job, plus 10. You can use the commutative property to rewrite it as a squared plus b squared equals c squared. All right, again, lesson 6.2, Pythagorean theorem, part 2. We're going to find a leg. So take a look at this triangle. It is a right triangle. So I'm going to write down the names, definitions that I have. Minus 10 bears, bring the front. There we go. This is a leg. By definition, the hypotenuse is going to be across diagonal from your right angle. This is the longest side in the triangle, so 2.9 centimeters is my hypotenuse. This has to be a leg. This is A. I'm going to call the other one B. If you want to, you can use the commutative property here, and you could call this leg B, and this one leg A, it doesn't matter. All right, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to square the decimals or whole numbers that I have. So in this case, they're decimals, so I'm going to square 2.1, and I'm going to square 2.9. Remember, squaring a number means to multiply it by itself. So I'm going to say 2.1 times 2.1 gives me 4.41. Do not multiply 2.1 by 2. That would be cub-like. All right, I'm going to square 2.9. Remember, squaring it means to multiply it by itself. All right, you're right. Minus 10 bears. It was a little sloppy there. When I multiply 2.9 by itself, square it, I get 8.41. Now, I need to find the missing leg. If you're asked to find the hypotenuse, you add the numbers together, and then you find the square root. But they're asking me to find the leg. So, you can think of your hypotenuse as your hippopotamus, and you have less food. Less means subtract, because your pet hippo ate some of it. So your pet hippo ate some of this food. You're going to subtract. So I'm going to take my two numbers and I'm going to subtract them. So I have 8.41 minus 4.41. Remember, if you're finding a missing leg, you're always going to subtract. When I do 8.41 minus 4.41, that should give me 4 whole, or 4. .0 is equivalent to 4 whole. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find the square root of 4. Plus 10 bears, because I beat you and said 4 is a perfect square. The square root of 4 is 2. So 2 is going to be the distance on my leg here. And to be more precise, it's going to be 2 centimeters. Process elimination, a little po. You should be able to see that your hypotenuse is 2.9. 2.9 is bigger than 2.1, and 2.9 is greater than 2 whole. If you told me the leg was any number greater than 2.9, epic fail. The legs always have to be smaller than the hypotenuse. All right, so just to review it, you have less food. Less means subtract, because your pet hippo ate some of it. Remember, if you're asked to find the leg in a right triangle, square the numbers, multiply the numbers by themselves. I squared the number, multiplied by itself. I squared the number, I multiplied it by itself. The second thing I'm going to do, if I'm asked to find the leg, I'm going to subtract the numbers, or subtract the answers. I subtracted the numbers. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find the square root. I found the square root. Here's a little handy-dandy chart that I just created. You might want to write it down to help you remember the difference. If you need to find the hypotenuse, square the numbers, add the answers, find the square root. Or if you need to find the longest side, which is the hypotenuse, That tells you you're going to have to add and then find the square root. If you need to find a leg, square the numbers, subtract the numbers, then find the square root. If you need to find the leg, square the numbers, subtract the answers, find the square root. If you need to find the shorter side or leg, you're going to subtract. Now you can compare and contrast the difference. Basically, you're going to add if you're asked to find the hypotenuse. You're going to subtract if you're finding the leg. That's the difference, guys. All right. I hope that today's podcast helped you find the missing leg in a right triangle. Stay tuned for our next awesome, dynamite, splendorific podcast on lesson 6.3, rational and irrational numbers. As always, see ya. I wouldn't want to be ya.